Welcome in the latest episode of that SEC podcast. I'm your host, Michael Bratton. I go by SEC Mike on Twitter. And hey, flying solo, but not for very long, because we got our weekly appearance here with Stephen Lassan, Athlon Sports. We're going to be able to hit on all 14 SEC teams as Stephen puts the SEC in tiers at the midway point of the season, and we preview the upcoming slate of games around the league. Big week in the SEC West. We mentioned it on the last episode. The top four in the West going head-to-head. This week may go a long way to determining the SEC West race. But, hey, before we get to our interview with Stephen Lassan, I just thought this was great. Nick Saban complaining about the refs. A lot of Alabama fans upset about these damn referees. And targeting. A play where Omari Thomas hit Bryce Young. They did review it. They said it was not targeting. After a review, Nick Saban not so sure about that one.
Were you given any kind of explanation on why the hit on Bryce wasn't ruled targeting?
No, we turned the plays in. I'm sure the league office will look at it and make a determination. There's two things that is an issue. At issue here is targeting, but you're also not supposed to hit the quarterback in the head. Last year against Texas A&M, Malachi got thrown out of the game. Guy was out of the pocket, jumped up to block the ball, and ended up almost accidentally hitting him in the head. Got ejected from the game. So there's really two things that should be looked at.
I just thought that was great. Nick Saban not getting his way for once in his life. He's upset. And I get it. I mean, hell, we all do it. We lose a game. We like to point at the officials. Every SEC fan is guilty of that. But I don't know. It's kind of wild to see how many calls Alabama's gotten over the years now. That's the reason they lost to Tennessee. So, hate to see it. But speaking of Nick Saban, Lane Kiffin, my goodness, if you missed it. Most people, I assume, watched the Tennessee-Alabama game. It was probably the most viewed college football game of the year to date. But there was a little moment where Nick Saban had a little bit of a tantrum on the sideline. Well, Lane Kiffin posted a picture of Nick Saban freaking out and photoshopped in there's a mustard bottle hitting him in the back of the head. Oh, man. Any other coach, I don't know if they'd get away with these social media shenanigans, but Lane Kiffin does not care whatsoever. I just thought that was the funniest damn thing I saw all weekend long. And speaking of Ole Miss, big game here at LSU. Maybe the toughest test of the season. Certainly the toughest road environment the Rebels are going to see to date this weekend, this season in Baton Rouge. Confusing myself here. But LSU-Ole Miss opened. Ole Miss favored by 2. Shane and I talked about that on the last episode. Well, the money has swung the point spread to LSU, now favored by 1.5. So, pretty much a toss-up type ball game, but it's pretty wild to see it open in favor of one team and flip to the other. Kind of gives you an indication. I mean, a lot of money on this game. A lot of people betting LSU after their big win on the road at Florida. Cannot wait to see this football game. And speaking of LSU, just want to give a shout out. Will Campbell, their true freshman left tackle, missed the Tennessee game. He was sorely missed. And it was clear LSU was not the same team without their true freshman left tackle. He was actually hospitalized the night before the Tennessee game, so he didn't play. And a week later against Florida, had a dominant performance, and he was named co-SEC Offensive Lineman of the Week. What a turnaround for that young guy. Just wanted to give him a shout out. He's going to be paramount this weekend in this Ole Miss game. But I can't recall, quite a one game to another massive comeback. And again, this is a true freshman playing left tackle in the nation's toughest conference. You just don't see that often. I know Alabama's done it a couple times with some monsters that they've sent to the first round. Looks like Will Campbell, if he continues to progress, he may be on that level here in about 3 years. But speaking of Ole Miss and Tennessee, two teams we hit on here, pretty interesting. Just wanted to call attention to this. Pick 6 previews. Our buddy Brett Cianca wanted to point out Ole Miss 7-0. This is the first time Ole Miss is 7-0 since 2014. Tennessee 6-0, first time since 1998. Ooh, boy, if I'm an Ole Miss or Tennessee fan, we're having a magical season here. And speaking of the Vols, people getting tired of hearing about the Vols, but hey, this is the last thing I got on them here. Dave Bartu, our buddy, who's on the show on Friday. Go back and check it out if you missed it. He's highly entertaining. And if you don't follow Bartu that closely, now is a great time to start following his work because we got college football playoff rankings coming out here in the coming weeks. And he and his partner, Adam McClintock, they have cracked the formula for the college football playoff committee, how they rate their teams. Bartu, on his Patreon page, the rankings come out on a Monday night, or it's Monday night or Tuesday night, I can't remember, but it comes out whatever day it comes out. Bartu posts what his projections of the playoff top 25, and of the 25 he usually gets about 23 24 of them, and he gets them between 1 to 2 spots of where the actual rankings is. So that's incredibly impressive. He truly has cracked the code, and this was not like a 1-year thing. He's done this for about 4 years in a row. The playoff committee comes out here and says, well, strength of record, strength of this, blah blah blah. It's all BS, according to Bartu. They're using a simple formula that he has cracked. And I say all that to say this. According to Dave Bartu, right now, if the playoff committee released the rankings, Tennessee would be number 1 in the playoff rankings. So if they continue to win, of course, I think the first ranking will come after the Kentucky game. I'm not 100% sure on that. I'll look that up. But if they continue to win, Tennessee is going to debut as the number 1 team in the college football playoff poll. That is just incredible to think about, the wild ride there. But hey, that's enough Vol talk for now. They basically got a bye week. So last thing here, just wanted to call attention to this. The SEC has announced the kickoffs and broadcast information for Saturday, October the 29th. Upcoming slate here. Pretty good one here. So Georgia, Florida, that was already previously announced. SEC on CBS. That's the case every year. The fanfare around that game. Hopefully Florida can make it a little bit more competitive. Both those teams got 2 weeks to prepare for that ball game. So pretty interesting to see Billy Napier in his first contest against Kirby Smart. But we've got a noon Eastern, 11 o'clock Central kick between Arkansas and Auburn. I think that's a huge win if you're an Arkansas fan. Tired of all these 11 a.m. kickoffs. You'll appreciate this one. All the road down there on the plains, you want to snap a streak. I believe Auburn's longest winning streak over an SEC West opponent currently is Arkansas. So catch a little bit of a break there if you're an Arkansas fan. Missouri at South Carolina. That's going to kick off at 4 o'clock Eastern, 3 Central on the SEC Network. Night games, 2 great ones. 7 o'clock Eastern, 6 Central. Kentucky at Tennessee, nationally televised ESPN. This is going to be Kentucky's Super Bowl. They're going to have 2 weeks to prepare. This is their opportunity to play spoiler of all spoilers. This is lining up to be one hell of a game. Kentucky at Tennessee. Cannot wait for that. And then the other night game, this should be a really fun game too. 7:30 Eastern, 6:30 Central. Ole Miss at Texas A&M on the SEC Network. Ole Miss won that game last season. Defense did such a good job. Jimbo turned around and said, "Give me that DJ Durkin," when Mike Elko left for Duke. So I don't know if there's bad blood there between Durkin and his Lane Kiffin and everything, but funny storyline going into that matchup. Ole Miss could be undefeated. A&M, they've got an opportunity to have some momentum if they can beat South Carolina on the road going into that matchup. So that looks to be one hell of a night game there on October 29th. But all right, that's enough of me spieling here. Let's kick it over to our interview with Steven Lassan. All right, we're pleased to once again be joined by a friend of the show, Steven Lassan. You know him, Athlon Steven on the Twitter machine. And don't forget to check out his outstanding YouTube channel, All CFB 365. Steven, how's it going, my friend?
Hey, Mike, it's good to talk to you, especially after a huge weekend of games around the SEC and college football. It was great to see, I mean, not only just the matchups, how big they were, but also it was great that they lived up to the hype. And it was, kind of from start to finish on Saturday. It was a great weekend of games. So I'm excited to talk to you about it and break everything down.
Yeah, I don't know about you, Steven, but it feels like we're getting back to, the college football we love, the college football we grew up on where, man, underdogs are winning. It's not, I know Georgia and Ohio State and Alabama, they're still mighty. They may even make the college football playoff for all I know. But, seeing these teams go down or at least be challenged, it just makes the sport fun. What's your thoughts on that?
I agree with you. I think, first of all, I think it could be due to some of the roster changes that we've seen in the sport. Rosters are older now because of some of the super seniors that we've had. But also, the transfer portal movement. Like, I think it's a lot easier for the middle of college football to be more competitive against the top, especially with quarterback transfers. I mean, quarterback transfers can move around a lot more easily. It helps teams get better a lot right away. We also had 30 coaching changes, 29, 30 coaching changes last year. So there's just a lot of change going on in the sport, and with NIL and the portal. Roster stuff more than ever seems to be, kind of more fluid than ever, but also it's giving teams an opportunity. So I think there's certainly more parity perhaps in the sport. And I think for college football as a whole, unless you're a fan of Alabama, Ohio State, or Georgia, and they don't make the playoff or something, I think it's good sometimes for the sport to have some new faces in there. So I would be curious to see where this goes, but I think to the average fan of college football, new blood at the top is always good and keeps things interesting.
Yeah, and to that point, Stephen, I think it's a little bit tougher to build quality depth because, I mean, if let's say you're one of these teams at the top, you're recruiting 4 and 5 star players almost exclusively, and if they're not playing by their second year, maybe even their third, I mean, they're out the door. They're going off to another program. I know we made a big deal out of Alabama. They ought to be lucky, Stephen, that they got Gibbs and they got Henry To'oTo'o and they got a couple of these transfers because, without these guys, I'm not burying the Alabama Crimson Tide, but without
Mike is declaring that the dynasty is over. Here we go.
Without some of these transfers, I mean, they're in serious trouble. You know what?
Yeah, I think to your point, the depth of the rosters are going to be something that we're going to have to watch going forward. And I do think right now it is a lot harder to keep everybody happy. I think it is incumbent on the coaches to build some sort of culture and team that players want to stick around. And I think that's something that, to use a team outside the SEC, Dabo Swinney at Clemson has always been big on internal, we're going to coach our guys. We're going to develop those guys. I don't really necessarily want to go into the portal, but we've built something here that can keep the 85-man roster largely intact, and the coaching staff has largely stayed together up until last season. I think that's really hard to do in this era of college football because I think you're going to see players move around more. How do you keep guys that were high-profile recruits happy when they're not getting a ton of playing time right away? They could go maybe to the school 1 state over or 2 states over that's got an NIL deal, and you can come play right away. So there is this unknown element of how this is all going to work over the next 5 to 10 years. But I think if anything else, like we said, it's going to create some new opportunities, but also I think it's just going to keep things more interesting. And it will help the teams at the top. There's no doubt about it. Alabama's going to reload in the portal this offseason, but look at some of the other teams around the SEC, Ole Miss, Tennessee. There's going to be opportunities for other teams to load up quickly because of the portal and some of these other changes that we've seen.
Well, Stephen, one of the things I really wanted to have you on to discuss this week, we are essentially at the midway point of the college football season. So I thought it'd be interesting. I put out my weekly power rankings and I get tons and tons of hate. So I want to direct some of that hate your way, Stephen, and I want to see how you have the SEC in tiers, so to speak. And I'm leaving this completely up to you, Stephen. You could do it based on how these teams have looked to your eye. How you think they're going to project towards the end of the season. But let's start with the elite of the elite in the SEC. According to Stephen Lassan, who's in your elite category there in the SEC right now?
I've got three teams in that category. I've got Tennessee, Alabama, and Georgia. I think any of those teams will win the SEC this year. I don't think that's much of a surprise. Like, those are your front runners. You could maybe throw Ole Miss into that conversation because they still have to play Alabama. After this week, week 7, I've got Tennessee at number 1 in my power rankings because they have the best
Ooh.
win in the conference by beating Alabama. If you ask me who I think ends up at number 1 at the end of the year, that might be a different discussion, because I think there's probably a good chance that it's one of the other two teams, Alabama or Georgia. But at this point of the season, if you're Tennessee, you just beat the number 1 team in my mind last week. You have to be number 1 going into week 8.
Let me ask you this, Stephen. Why do you hate Ole Miss?
She definitely tried to get me in trouble, right? I think I don't have them in the same tier as the other three, because I think for number 1, I just think from a team perspective, I think those three teams are just on a different level. I also trust the quarterbacks at those other three schools a little bit more. I like what I've seen out of Jackson Dart for the most part this year. But I think one of the weirdest things about Ole Miss that I've noticed is they seem to have these stretches where they look really dominant, and then they have other stretches where they just like kind of shut things off and they go back to being inconsistent. We saw this against Auburn. We saw this against, when they played some of the Tulsa in the non-conference game. They jumped out to the lead. Vanderbilt jumped on them early. So I don't know that they are necessarily as good as all the other three teams. I do think that a lot of credit should be given to Lane Kiffin, though, because they've been able to reload it. And the fact that we're even talking about them as potentially a tier 1 team in the SEC is something I probably would not have predicted back in the offseason, considering they lost Matt Corral and had to reload this offseason. So I think Kiffin is doing a really nice job. I just think those other three teams are better right now.
Well, let's stay in that elite tier for right now, Stephen. I wanted to ask you about the Georgia Bulldogs' big comeback, or not comeback, but bounce back after a couple sloppy performances. I guess that Auburn game was not too sloppy, but 55-0 just smacked Vanderbilt. Does this give you confidence that this is the Georgia we saw early in the season, or do you think maybe that was a little bit of a factor of the competition and Vanderbilt clearly not being ready to compete with the elite of the elite in the SEC?
It's a great question, because I think we're going to find out pretty soon where Georgia is, because after the off week, they get Florida and then they'll get Tennessee, of course. And I think the question is going to be which Georgia team shows up in those games. Is it the team that pounded Oregon in the season opener or struggled to beat Missouri? That's kind of the debate I have every time I kind of start thinking about Georgia's future this season. Like, which team are we going to get from week to week? I think they're probably closer in terms of strength to the team that we saw in the season opener and the team we saw against Auburn and Vanderbilt. Like, when everything is clicking, I think that's the team that can show up week in and week out. This team can win the national championship, and I think that's the kind of level that we'll probably get after the off week. Give Georgia some time to get everyone healthy, continue to figure out things on defense, and they can play up to that number 1 standard that we saw last year and earlier this year.
Do you have confidence that Georgia's defense will match up better against Tennessee's offense than Alabama's defense, which, this is a work in progress. I get it. But I believe, Stephen, you said a week or two ago you thought Alabama had the best defense in the country, and the stats back that up. So how do you think Georgia's defense, which if Alabama isn't number 1, Georgia probably is. So how's that matchup looking in your eye?
Man, it's going to be a great matchup. I think one thing, if you're Georgia, what probably gives you some confidence is if you give Kirby Smart an off week and he just watched his buddy Nick Saban's defense get annihilated by Tennessee. He now has a couple weeks to sort of figure things out, him and that staff. I think the question with Georgia's defense this year is not necessarily whether or not they're going to be number 1, number 2 at the end of the year. I think it's just how fast is it going to come together. And I think we've seen that. They're not getting sacks this year, but I think it's really about can they get pressure. And I think the young players on that defense have progressed a lot over the course of the season. Now they have to take it up another level. So I would say, just in terms of matchup, Tennessee's offense versus Georgia's defense, if you just torched Alabama's defense, I would feel pretty good if I'm Tennessee, because there's no Will Anderson on Georgia. Yes, Georgia's defense is really good, but I thought Alabama would be able to get a stop or two with a little bit more consistency on Saturday. The secondary is the one thing that would probably worry me if I'm Georgia. How do you match up against Tennessee's receivers, especially with Jalen Hyatt's having a great year and Cedric Tillman might be back by then. So I'm very curious to see how the secondary of Georgia holds up. I think in terms of just team strength, based upon what we saw on Saturday, I think Alabama's defense is still better. And if Tennessee did that, they have that potential to do that to Georgia in a few weeks too.
Now, I heard you say something interesting earlier today, Stephen, and I don't necessarily even disagree with you. But Saturday night, Hendon Hooker, Bryce Young going head to head, and Hendon Hooker, incredible. I think he could have played a little bit better. It's hard to pick apart a guy that scores 5 touchdowns on a Nick Saban defense, but Bryce Young looked like the better quarterback in that football game. But I asked that to say, is Hendon Hooker right now the leader to win the Heisman Trophy out of the SEC, or is it Bryce Young? Is it someone else in your mind?
It's got to be Hendon Hooker. I think certainly team strength and wins matter in the Heisman Trophy. Like if I was to give you every team in college football and told you could take any quarterback you wanted, I'm probably picking Bryce Young at 1, just because I think he's the best pure quarterback in college football right now. But Hendon Hooker's not very far behind that. Neither is C.J. Stroud at Ohio State. It's a really good 3-man race to be the best quarterback in the country this year. But if you played, the way the Hendon Hooker played on Saturday in a big-time performance with the nation watching you, and if that was the number 1 defense and they torched them, like we saw them torch Alabama's defense, he has to be the Heisman favorite at this point of the year. So long way to go, but I think Hendon Hooker is doing a very good job of getting his name into the conversation to win it this year for sure.
How surprised are you, Stephen, that Tennessee's offensive line did such a good job against Will Anderson and that Alabama front seven? Because you got to remember, they struggled against Pitt. Now, you told us on this show, Pitt's got a really good defensive line. That bared true on the field, at least in that game. I haven't watched Pitt since, but I thought LSU could give Tennessee nightmares. They gave them none. I certainly thought Alabama could give them nightmares. They gave them none. How surprised are you that Tennessee's offensive line is playing to the standard that they are?
Is that maybe the underrated story of the game for Tennessee? Was that everybody's talking about Hendon Hooker and Jalen Hyatt, and rightfully so, but that the line of scrimmage held up for Tennessee. I mean, they held Jahmyr Gibbs to 3.7 yards per carry. I mean, he was great, and he made some just nasty moves in the defense to score a couple times and all that. And you definitely see why he's going to be, maybe first, second team All-American by the end of the year. But I think the other story is, I mean, Will Anderson was really quiet in that game for Alabama. I think Tennessee did a lot as far as getting rid of the ball, quick reads, double teams, whatever it was, to keep Will Anderson away from Hendon Hooker. But if you gave me odds before the game, I would have said Will Anderson probably makes a play or two for Alabama. And, I think he had a couple tackles and, had a tackle for loss, but for the most part, he was relatively quiet. And then Tennessee's offensive line, to be able to establish the run enough so that way Alabama had to respect that. And then it sets up the deep shots that we saw. I mean, I think that's sort of the underrated storyline for me, is coming into the game, I thought Alabama had the edge there. And Tennessee, if nothing else, at least played them to a draw or played better than we anticipated to set up that victory on Saturday.
In your mind, Stephen, is there something wrong with Alabama? I mean, they continue to struggle on the road. They keep having all these damn penalties. They're making special team errors time and time again. And, you had to believe at some point this was going to catch up to them. And of course it did. Do you think there's something really wrong with Nick Saban's program? I mean, this was supposed to be the revenge tour, yet it's looked like a barely hanging on tour here.
Yeah, I mean it's a interesting debate that I haven't quite pinpointed the source of like what's going on. Like I think there's a couple things. I think the offensive line is not as dominant, maybe as we're used to seeing on some of those other teams. Also at receiver, there's a lot of really good receivers. There's just no Jamison Williams or John Mechie this year. We also saw the secondary had a lot of trouble on Saturday defending Tennessee. And I think you can also look at the defensive line. I think there's a lot of really good players there, but there's no Quinnen Williams ready to create havoc at the line of scrimmage. So I don't know if there's necessarily anything wrong as much as maybe they're just not as elite at a few positions as we're used to seeing. And that's why they're not as dominant. The penalties and turnovers and weird, special teams mistakes that keep happening are just something you don't expect like a Nick Saban team to go through. Like I think after last year when they struggled on the road, I thought for sure they would have some of these things fixed, and to be seeing the same things over and over again is really bizarre. So I it's kind of hard to put into words what's going on. The only thing I think if you're Nick Saban, you could look at it and say, hey, our back is against the wall. We cannot lose the rest of the year. So all this stuff that's been going wrong with penalties and turnovers, it's got to end, or otherwise Alabama's going to be playing in the Sugar Bowl and watching Tennessee and Georgia play in the college football playoff.
Well, having said that, Stephen, given the issues that Alabama has had, do you have more confidence in them winning out, or more confidence that they may drop another game? Because you got to remember they got to play at LSU, which looks to be a improving football team, at Ole Miss, undefeated Ole Miss, Mississippi State. Kind of breaks my heart. They're a disappointment, but yeah, if they play up to their standard, that's a ball game. So I don't know. What do you have more confidence in there for Alabama?
I'm going to bank on Alabama responding the rest of the way and probably winning out. I a little bit more of kind of trepidation than I would have had any other time. I just think that we've seen now the struggles on the road are not a one-time deal. The game against Arkansas, they started out well. Arkansas came back. Like that's kind of the outlier at this point over the last 2 years. And Bryce Young was hurt in that game, so we didn't get a full game of data. But going on the road to LSU, as if they keep improving, they still have to play Ole Miss, which we know Lane Kiffin is probably going to have some things ready for his old friend Nick Saban. So I do think going on the road is a big challenge for Alabama. But I'm going to just bank on the fact that I think they've got a difference maker in Bryce Young. This defense cannot play as bad as it did on Saturday. I think it's going to be a very miserable week around practice at Tuscaloosa, and they will be ready for the rest of the year. So I'm picking Alabama to win out and get to the SEC championship game.
All right, so who's in your tier 2 of SEC teams?
Yeah, I think Ole Miss is really the one team in tier 2 right now for me. I think, coming into the week, a top 10 team. I think what's interesting to me is what's kind of behind that in the second to third tier, because Kentucky, LSU, and Mississippi State are all right there in that tier 2, tier 2.5, tier 3. Like I think Ole Miss has kind of separated itself right now because they're in the top 10. But I think if you wanted to look at long term the rest of the season, the games coming up will kind of determine whether that tier 2, tier 3 is kind of smashed together. And I think that probably bears out. Kentucky played Ole Miss close. LSU getting Ole Miss this week, I think, will be a close game as well. So I think Ole Miss is tier 2. I'm sort of going to change my answer and go just kind of smush all those teams into that second tier as well.
So let me ask you this, Stephen, with the upcoming schedule for Ole Miss, I mean, I've already kind of said this, so I'm kind of curious to hear your thoughts, but to me, Ole Miss is not really built to be blowing people out because they're dominant on the ground. Maybe they had, what was it, like 400 plus rushing yards on Auburn, and they still didn't blow them out. And the defense, which looked like one of the most impressive units in the conference early in the season. I don't want to say they're falling apart, but my God, Stephen, I think Auburn, we'll get to them in a minute, but to me, they may be the worst team in the SEC, and they basically had their way with this defense. So the way I kind of see it, Ole Miss, I think, is going to be in dogfights more often than not with the rest of the SEC West on their schedule. What's your thoughts on that?
I agree with you. I think a couple things that I like about Ole Miss. I love the Evans and Judkins pairing on the ground in the offensive line for Ole Miss and the way that it's played all year. I think to go back to something that we were talking about just a minute ago is, Jackson Dart has been, kind of up and down. And I think that also sort of speaks to just where this team has been this year, too. I mean, the start against Vanderbilt, they started slow. This happened on Saturday, too. I thought they were going to, handle Auburn with ease, and they couldn't stop Tank Bigsby and Auburn's running game. And it became much more back and forth, I think, than I expected. So I think the pieces are there. The question is whether they can take those pieces and play with more consistency week to week in the passing game and on defense. And I also think too, like we talked about this, but credit to Kiffin for getting this team to this point. I don't think that they're as good as some of the other teams like Alabama. LSU's upside with talent, and if the pieces start to fall into place with Brian Kelly, if we see the Jaden Daniels that we saw on Saturday night, then I think Ole Miss's defense will certainly have trouble stopping LSU's passing game this week too.
You kind of already answered a question I was going to ask you, Stephen. Who you have more confidence in, the undefeated Ole Miss or one-loss Alabama to win the West? You said Alabama you're leaning with. So what percentage would you give Ole Miss right now to surprise you a little bit here and make it to Atlanta?
Man, it's a really good question. I'd say maybe 10-15%. I'm pretty high in Alabama putting the pedal down and finding that next gear for the rest of the way. With, like I said, some trepidation, because I keep thinking that Alabama is going to find that next tier and just sort of play at the dominant level that we expect. And but they haven't been able to do that. So I say that with a little bit of hesitation. I just think kind of some of the same things that we're talking about is, if hypothetically down the road, can Ole Miss slow down Bryce Young? And in a game where they're probably going to need Jackson Dart to be able to make a couple throws in that game, are they going to be able to get that with the consistency to match scores with Alabama? I think is a big question. And that's why I would probably give Alabama pretty heavy odds to get back to Atlanta at this point.
Man, I can hear the mad rebels typing now, Stephen. Remember, he said it, not me. He's at Athlon, Stephen. I'm sorry, Stephen. Who else did you have in this tier? Mississippi State, you said, in LSU?
Yeah, and I threw Kentucky in there too, because I think give Kentucky credit, because they beat Mississippi State, of course, on Saturday, lost close to Ole Miss. I feel like this tier is really close in my mind, but I have Ole Miss just sort of like in tier 2, and these are like tier 2.5 and not too far behind Ole Miss. I feel like this is where we're going to see some movement over the next couple games, because Ole Miss plays LSU and they still have to play Mississippi State.
Do you think Mississippi State at the end of this year, Stephen, is going to look back and say, my God, we missed an opportunity? I mean, that LSU game, I don't understand how they blew that one. And then Kentucky, they basically no-showed. I don't know what to make of this damn team.
Yeah, and not to mention, their November schedule, they still have to play, of course, Alabama, but they still have to play Georgia and Ole Miss as well. I feel like the schedule the rest of the way is pretty difficult for Mississippi State in some spots. I think there is a case of what if, because we saw the potential for this team when they put the pedal down and beat Texas A&M. They beat Arkansas without KJ Jefferson, of course, but LSU early in the season was not playing at the level we saw on Saturday night. They had a chance to go into Baton Rouge and win a very winnable game. Also on Saturday, Kentucky was just getting Will Levis back in his first game. It's a team that struggled to run the ball, and Rodriguez had a great game on Saturday night too. So I think there is a little bit of what if for Mississippi State here. They have some opportunities with Georgia and Ole Miss to finish the season high, but certainly I think they could be a lot closer to Ole Miss had they pulled one of those games off by now.
How huge was that win for LSU over the weekend? I mean, I don't know how impressive Florida really is, but it was on the road. But the reason it's big in my mind, Stephen, they had just got worked by Tennessee. They're turning around and playing Ole Miss and Alabama and A&M and Arkansas. I mean, the downward slide could have been ridiculous for LSU had they lost Saturday, and I think they would have been a heavy underdog against Ole Miss. Now they're a slight favorite. Was that possibly a season-defining win for LSU over the weekend?
Yeah, I think so. I think it gives LSU something to build upon. And if nothing else, I think the rebound from losing big to Tennessee in Baton Rouge and then going on the road to Gainesville and winning is just significant for where this program is under Brian Kelly. And also after, you and I had talked last week about, offensive questions and Mike Denbrock and what can he do to improve and going forward. And here they come out and just scored. The first 6 times they touched the ball with touchdowns. Jay Daniels threw for over 300 yards. I think maybe probably the biggest news in all this was Will Campbell coming back on the offensive line, getting him back in the line played better. So I think if you're LSU, there's a chance here to build something down the stretch. There's of course the game against Alabama, but you're going to get a shot against Ole Miss at home. You also have to play A&M. So we've seen that this team can put together some of those performances. And I think if they get some of what we saw on Saturday, there's a chance for this team to really finish on a high note for sure.
And how does this set up for Kentucky now, Stephen? You get the win. A lot of people didn't have you getting it. I predicted it. I only remind that because I get so many games wrong, but I did see that one coming. Kentucky, now you go into the bye week, 2 weeks. You get to rest Will Levis. Like you said, Chris Rodriguez really heating up. And man, I got to imagine if I'm Kentucky Wildcat, this Tennessee game now is my Super Bowl of a season. You come in here and play the ultimate spoiler. Who knows? Maybe Georgia trips up elsewhere, gives you an opportunity to make that a huge game. But it certainly seems like things are kind of lining up for Kentucky. I'm not sitting here saying they're going to beat Tennessee in Neyland Stadium. They've done it before. But, with Will Levis and Chris Rodriguez, a balanced attack, Stephen, I believe 239 passing, 239 rushing against Mississippi State. You literally can't do any more balance than that. So, how do they match up, you think, with the red hot Tennessee team?
Yeah, I think the thing that would give me a little bit of anxiety if I'm a Tennessee fan would be the fact that Kentucky's got 2 weeks to get ready for this game. And that gives Will Levis a chance to get back to 100%. Also, I think Kentucky's offensive line and running game, with what they showed on Saturday against Mississippi State, they've now got 2 weeks to continue to build on that. And also, maybe they get some guys healthy that have been banged up, including Will Levis and some others. So I think the win plus the bye week came at a really good time for Kentucky. Like, you can build some momentum going to the bye week and continue that on the road against Tennessee. Had they lost that game, with the way they played against South Carolina and Ole Miss, it's a little different story. And looking down the road, Missouri, Vanderbilt, and Louisville, all very winnable. So there's a chance for this Kentucky team, I think, to get to 8-4, even if they stumble against Tennessee or Georgia. 8-4 still gets you into the back half of the top 25 in a pretty good bowl game. So I think I'm interested to see if that offensive development we saw on the line continues into, like you said, what could be Kentucky's Super Bowl to play spoiler against Tennessee in a couple of weeks.
All right, Stephen. So who's in your tier 3 in the SEC?
I might find out that I'm pretty consistent with head to head. So I went with A&M and Arkansas in the tier 3, I guess. It's really close. Like, I think over the course of the season, could they be a better team? I think that's, probably true. A&M, I'm curious to see where they go from here, because they played, they took Alabama to the last play of the game a few weeks ago. I love the way that Arkansas played against BYU on Saturday. I mean, just getting KJ Jefferson back. You and I talked last week about how I thought BYU was susceptible on the ground, and Arkansas took full advantage of that on Saturday. So I think in this tier, I'm giving A&M the edge because they had the head-to-head victory. But I really think there is some chance for Arkansas to build some momentum over the second half of the season because the schedule. And also, I think if they can get some guys healthy, the bye week really came at a good time for them.
For A&M, Stephen, do you think this? They got some tricky games coming up, no doubt. But how big does this South Carolina game loom? We're about to talk about it, but South Carolina's coming off an upset win of themselves, so they got some confidence. But if we're being completely honest, it doesn't matter where this game's played. Texas A&M, if they play up to their standard, should win this football game. If they drop it, man, I don't know. Well, there may finally be some upset Aggies at Jimbo, don't you think?
Oh, no doubt about it. I mean, the series trend in this series favors A&M. It's 8-0 since A&M joined the SEC against South Carolina. It has been a very one-sided affair. Last three matchups decided by 24 points or more. And I think what's interesting about that is if you look at the series trend, and then your eyes go right to the spread for this game, being less than a touchdown is giving South Carolina a lot of respect. But I also think it sort of speaks to the nature of inconsistency that we've seen out of Texas A&M this year. I think the bye week, much like we talked about with Arkansas, will do them some good. I still think that this team is pretty much kind of what we thought. I mean, offensively, that they've had some moments where it looks like maybe they're going to break out of the slump. Maybe the off week can give them a little bit more time to work on things up front. I still want to see Connor Wigman at some point this year. A&M's back half of the schedule this season is very loaded in terms of home games. So maybe once you get past this game, you start to work the young quarterback in. But, I think it's important over the next month of the season for A&M to show some progress on offense and sort of kind of dictate where things go at the end of this year and in 2023 for Fisher, sort of to maybe force the effort to hire an OC, shake up things a little bit on offense. But, hey, Saturday night's game, based upon the history, this is a game that A&M should win.
Right. And they're a little bit of a tricky spot, Stephen, because they're loaded with young talent, incredible talent, very good players making big time plays against Alabama. But that's a double-edged sword because you go on the road in the SEC. Sometimes these players are outstanding. Sometimes they make questionable decisions that cost you ball games. So, some of these games, maybe not South Carolina, but some of these other games, Stephen, can't afford mistakes if A&M's going to come out on the winning side. So let me ask you about Arkansas, Stephen, going into a bye week, of course. And, man, they desperately needed that win over BYU. They got it done. How much momentum does that give them on the backside of that? They're going to have the Auburn Tigers. It is on the road. But, man, I think you got to, if you're an Arkansas fan, you got to like your odds to at least be in that ball game, if not win it.
Yeah, no doubt about it. I mean, I think what's encouraging if you're Arkansas is you look at their schedule, 5 games left. The 2 road games are Auburn and Missouri, and you're going to get LSU, Ole Miss, an old SEC friend, Hugh Freeze, coming back for a non-conference game. So I think the schedule sets up favorably for Arkansas to make a run. Like if you had to pick a perfect schedule, getting the toughest games, the remaining games on the schedule at home is a good way to do it. Arkansas's defense is what it is this year. The secondary is just going to struggle the rest of the year, but give me a healthy KJ Jefferson and Rocket Sanders in all these games, and I think Arkansas's got a chance to potentially win a good chunk of those. I mean, if you look at the quarterbacks they're going to be facing, I mean, Liberty's been inconsistent on offense. We know Jaden Daniels has been inconsistent. Same thing with Jackson Dart, Auburn, and Missouri. So I know the secondary has been an issue for Arkansas, but those games, if they can get what we saw from KJ Jefferson in that offense on Saturday, I think there's a good chance that Arkansas goes on a run to finish the season for sure.
So it sounds like Tennessee light, Stephen. I mean, high scoring games. You just hope you win a shootout. You know what?
Hey, yeah. I mean, that's the best chance for Arkansas. I mean, we saw this against BYU. Like I said, the defense is what it is. It gave up some big plays in the passing game. BYU moved the ball through the air, but they got a couple timely takeaways and was able to get the ball back to Jefferson. And also, I think if you look at how Arkansas's season played out in the first half, I mean, to lose in that fashion to A&M, there's no shame in losing to Alabama, and then to go on the road and be missing KJ Jefferson, like there, you can sort of talk through a very kind of thing what's going on this season for Arkansas. So I'm not as down on Arkansas maybe as some were after the 3-game losing streak. I think it's perfectly reasonable to lose to Alabama. Your quarterback gets hurt, and then they could finish on a high note to close out November. So I'm pretty optimistic on Arkansas the rest of the way.
So who's in your next SEC tier there, Stephen?
I've got Florida and South Carolina kind of grouped together at this point. I don't know what to expect out of Florida from week to week. You and I have talked about Florida. I mean, when they played Utah and when they played Tennessee, they went toe to toe with two teams that are in the top 25. I've got Tennessee at 1. I have Utah in my top 15 after last week. So they've been able to play with teams that are highly ranked. But the performance that we saw on Saturday, I mean, they just need more consistency from Anthony Richardson passing game and also the defense with the way that it played on Saturday night. There's still a long way to go on that side of the ball. I group South Carolina in this tier because I think that they're better than Auburn and Missouri and Vanderbilt. And I also think that we just talked about A&M schedule having to go to South Carolina. Like there's an opportunity here for South Carolina to build some wins over the next couple of weeks. And we saw the way that South Carolina got the running game going with Marshawn Lloyd. If that balance can continue, I think you have to feel optimistic if you're South Carolina about finishing on a high note. So some of this is just unpredictability of Florida, and some of this is maybe there's a little bit of upside with South Carolina the rest of the way.
What's your read on Florida after a couple of games here, Stephen? What are they, 4-2, and the defense falling apart, like you said, or no, I'm sorry, they're 4-3, right?
Yeah, they're 4-3. Yeah.
4-3, Billy. I mean, and I'm seeing these Florida accounts. They're like, well, Steve Spurrier was 6-1, Urban was 5-2, and Jim McElwain was 6-1 after like comparing him to some of the greatest coaches of all time here. But maybe I'm guilty. I hyped up Florida a little bit here, but he did have a damn gauntlet right out the gate. We cannot forget that. So I don't know. I guess my roundabout question here, Stephen, is: are you concerned at all in the Florida fans don't want to hear it, but the rebuild process or the building of the program that Billy Napier is currently under? And let's not forget the guy's got like 24 stars committed to the program for next year. You know what?
I hate to be, I guess maybe like every time we talk about this, I should just say like I'm probably the world's most patient person when it comes to like, so I'd be like really bad at like message boards or anything because I'd be like, hey, let's calm down just a little bit. I'm not worried about Billy Napier at Florida at all right now. I think it's just too early to get overly concerned. Like I thought the defense would be a little bit better on Saturday night and it got torched by LSU. I think for Napier going forward, just obviously more consistency out of the quarterback passing game. Some of that is just they just need more weapons at receiver. He brought in Montrell Johnson as a transfer. They have Trevor Etienne. I think you have to like the progress that they've shown on the offensive line and in the running game. And I think if you can give Anthony Richardson some more weapons or you get other quarterbacks to push him, you're going to be in better shape, obviously offensively. And I think defensively, I know like I'm really bad at like voting on all conference teams at the beginning of the season because I'm going to miss like, I don't know what the percentage is. They're going to be wrong. But I can tell you that one of the things that stood out to me when I was doing the one for Athlon Sports this offseason, I found myself not having a lot of Florida players in consideration on defense, probably fewer than I was normally would do in previous years. So I think it's just going to take time for Florida. And the kind of the weird thing in all this is, Billy Napier has a tendency, we've talked about it, to play up and play down to teams. And you look at their schedule the rest of the way, they get, of course, Georgia, A&M, South Carolina, Vanderbilt, and Florida State. I think Florida State's much improved. We'll see on the road at A&M, and of course the game in Jacksonville against Georgia. That's not the easiest finish in the world. So I think the goal of this season, I think based upon Vegas was like 7 or 8 wins. And I think they'll fall somewhere, over 500. So I'm not worried yet. There's things to work on, obviously, but it's still year one of a rebuilding project and a team that wasn't playing at its peak when he took over.
Right. Well, since you're Mr. Patient, Stephen, let me ask you this. How patient should they be with Patrick Toney, the defensive coordinator? The guy's young. He's younger than me. I think he's like 28 years old or something. He's ridiculously young. But I'm not putting this all on him. Maybe it's the roster he inherited and everything. But and the pressure that is Florida Gators football. Do they need to bring in someone with a little bit more experience, or because some of these coaches, Stephen, they can ride too long with their guy. I mean, I guess the smart way is you got to evaluate them at the end of the season. But what's the bigger mistake? Firing a guy after 1 year, or going into year two with a guy that you're not 100% sure is the right guy for the job?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question because I do think you get a lot of scenarios where coaches around the country are very patient with their guy and they've been at a previous stop and it worked and they get to a big time conference and it doesn't work and they don't want to make a change because, hey, that guy's been with me for 3 or 4 years and I can't get rid of him. I don't think we're there yet. Like Patrick Toney was really good at Louisiana, and the defense for Louisiana was really bad when that staff got there, and they hired Ron Roberts. He left to go to Baylor, and Toney took over and just basically kept doing what they were doing from a production standpoint. So I thought that he was one of the better hires that Billy Napier made. It may not age well, but I think, based upon what he did at Louisiana, I think he deserves a little bit more time. I think some of this really just is they just need more talent on defense at this point, and it's not something that could have been fixed overnight. Of course, you don't really want to give up 40 points to LSU considering how they played, but I'm going to be Mr. Patience on Patrick Toney at this point.
Well, and hey, sticking on that theme, Stephen, staying true to your guys. South Carolina offensive coordinator Marcus Satterfield. I know you, Stephen. You're not the we got to fire this guy. You're not on that. You're never on that bandwagon. But does that unit need to improve in your mind to guarantee that he sees a year 3 at South Carolina? What do they need to accomplish on that side of the ball for you to have confidence that South Carolina is moving in the right direction on the offensive side of the ball?
My answer here might surprise you. I might not be Mr. Patience here. I think sometimes when I watch South Carolina, it's sort of frustrating when you see the pieces that they have, and you don't see that translating into production or just different ways that you could use, some of those playmakers or get, make things easier for Spencer Rattler. Some of this is offensive line. I mean, I think South Carolina's offensive line from an advanced metric standpoint is really struggling. We can see it with the eye test. But I think if I'm South Carolina, these next couple games are really important. I would lean, if I'm Shane Beamer, that, you really need to see progress. Otherwise, I think a change at the end of the year wouldn't be the worst thing here. I think South Carolina over 2 years, from a production standpoint, in order to take that big step forward in the SEC, you're going to need more out of your offense. So if I'm South Carolina, if I don't see improvement, then I would say, yeah, it's time for something different there.
So your final tiers, Stephen, you said you got Auburn, Missouri, Vanderbilt. Hey, at least Auburn, I mean, they've not given up on Brian Harsin. I figured they would have given up about a month ago. They're still fighting hard. They're lacking talent. What kind of adjustments would you like to see them make on the Plains going into the bye week to try to avoid, like a 4-8 type season that could very well happen?
Yeah, I've got Auburn and Missouri in this tier. And of course, they're linked together because of the crazy game that they played earlier this year. I think you're right. I mean, for Auburn, they could have packed it in. They could have packed it in weeks ago. And, Brian Harsin's still very much on the hot seat. His address will probably not be in Alabama next year, but they keep fighting. And on Saturday, when they got down, I thought Ole Miss was just going to run away with it. But they keep fighting. And I think that, at least if nothing else, Auburn is just probably not going to pack it in for the rest of the year. They're probably going to be competitive in some of these games going forward. The biggest problem that Auburn has is the playmakers at receiver and quarterback. And it's hard to change that and during the year and without some recruiting in the offseason. They just don't have the consistency in the passing game and the difference makers on the outside. And of course, their offensive line, is inconsistent too. I love watching Tank Bigsby play. I think there's been some times this year where they go away from him too early. We saw this on Saturday with them kind of slicing up Ole Miss from a defensive standpoint. Auburn's biggest problem right now is they just don't have the consistency at quarterback and on offense and a receiver. And I don't really see how that changes much the rest of the way. They kind of have what they have at this point.
Mm. And the last time we talked about Missouri, Stephen, we talked about losing three one-score games back to back to back, first time in 50-some years, 60 years. Does that What does that say to you about Missouri? That they could potentially break through, or maybe they don't have the staff and the players to win these close games. I don't know. I mean, it's hard to see that continuing, given how rare that is. Does that give you a reason for hope, or a reason for thinking this season could turn? It's already kind of turned wrong, but continue to get worse, I guess, is a better way to put it.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think if I'm a Missouri fan, like those close calls against Georgia and Florida ought to give me some optimism for the second half of the year, because when you look at their schedule, playing South Carolina and Kentucky, Tennessee, New Mexico State, and Arkansas, like the only game in there that they're probably gonna the Tennessee's the only game in there that I think you would go ahead and just pencil in a loss for. If they play well like they did, if they play like they did against Georgia, they could show up and beat Kentucky at home. This feels like a really important stretch if they want to get to a bowl game this year. Like, I think at the beginning of the year, I thought 6, 7 wins would be a good year for them. And that's sort of the upside given where they are from a roster standpoint. But this next stretch will determine it. And it starts Saturday against Vanderbilt. Like they need to beat Vanderbilt in order to make a run at a bowl game. So I would be optimistic if I'm a Missouri fan, while also keeping in the back of my mind that this team needs to figure out a way to generate more big plays on offense, and they need more consistency at the quarterback from position from Brady Cook, or at some point this year, much like Texas A&M, I would love to see Sam Horn and see what he could do at some point, just to see if he gives the offense a spark. Blake Baker's done a nice job with the defense. I think that's been kind of one of the bigger surprises for me. So this next stretch of games might be make or break for Missouri's bowl hopes for sure.
So then, obviously, last team Vanderbilt in their final tier. Do you think this is a case, Stephen, of them? The SEC schedule, they've been going through it. They're playing poorly. Is about as well as you could say it. But my God, Stephen, I mean, Alabama, Ole Miss, and Georgia, who did this schedule for them? Literally could not, unless you threw Tennessee in there, it could not be getting any worse. Do you think this is a case of just a monstrous schedule, or do you think this is a case of the roster is not talented and deep and they're starting to falter? Do you have hope that they can swing it back around and build a little bit momentum and maybe pull off a conference upset here before the season ends?
I think coming into this year, I thought if they could win one game in SEC play, it would be a good season. Given where they were when Clark Lee took over, everything that happened last year, the roster just isn't there yet. And I think a win in SEC play would obviously be great, but I think it would just be like for Vanderbilt, if you're just more competitive in some of these games coming up. I mean, South Carolina, Missouri, Kentucky, Florida, and Tennessee. Tennessee's the one that one really could get out of hand. But if they could maybe play a little bit better in some of these games compared to what we saw last year, keep them closer, one score, 10 points. I think based upon what I've seen this year, Vanderbilt is getting better. They just need more from a roster and depth perspective. And I think you have to like what AJ Swan is doing at quarterback. There's certainly some upside for the future. So if Vanderbilt doesn't win an SEC game this year, I don't know that it necessarily changes my opinion. Luckily, I think he inherited a situation that needed time, and they're on the right track. I would like to see some progress in these next couple games, and that's really what I'm watching for the rest of the way.
Mm. Well, before you get out of here, Stephen, want to do a quick breakdown of the upcoming SEC schedule. Not a ton of games on the docket here. We got a non-conference game and then 4 conference matchups. We do have the top 4 in the SEC West going head-to-head. So this could be a huge weekend for determining the outcome of the SEC West race. So let's start right there, Stephen. Ole Miss at LSU, fascinating game. What's your thoughts on it?
The first thing that jumped out to me was the spread. Like the fact that it has been moving all around since it opened. For I guess since the end of the week came up on Sunday, like the fact that it's changed hands, and I think Vegas and the odds makers are really kind of have a tough time figuring out who to favor in this game. When you look at the history, LSU is 5-1 in the last six against Ole Miss, and Ole Miss has not won in LSU since 2008. So I think going into a very difficult environment for Ole Miss, a place that they have not played well, I think already sets the stage for me. And seeing that what these two teams did last week, LSU got the big win in Gainesville, Ole Miss won against Auburn. Can LSU do the same things that they did against Florida? Like, does Jaden Daniels come out, pick up where he left off? I think, can Ole Miss get the running game going against LSU's defense? If you're LSU, can you stop Zach Evans and Judkins and force Jackson Dart to beat you? So I think much of this may hinge on just the consistency from the two quarterbacks. Jackson Dart and Jaden Daniels have kind of been up and down this year. Both have shown a lot of good things this year too. So this one, I think, much like the odds makers, I'm having a hard time figuring out who I'm going to predict on Saturday, but it should be a good one.
Do you buy into the fact that Ole Miss could be playing kind of the disrespect card, and a lot of people jumping on LSU's bandwagon? Because I could see Lane Kiffin, Stephen. I mean, he'd just be totally unaware that that's going on, or I could see him, if they win, immediately after the game, just retweeting everybody that picked LSU to win the damn game. So, what's your thoughts on that? Is that just a stupid media topic, or do you think that really plays into this game?
No, I think it will. I think Ole Miss will be very motivated because people like me are wondering, are we going to get the consistency from week to week? Are we going to get the dominant Ole Miss that has shown up this year too? LSU has allowed over 200 rushing yards in back-to-back games to Florida and Tennessee, and some of that against Florida was the big touchdown run by Anthony Richardson. So there will be opportunities, I think, for Ole Miss to move the ball on the ground. But I think in the big picture, I mean, in the SEC West, I know we've talked about Ole Miss contending potentially, but I haven't seen a whole lot about it. It's just assuming that Alabama's going to be playing in Atlanta in December against Georgia or Tennessee. So I think if you're Lane Kiffin, you're kind of liking the idea that, hey, you're flying under the radar. This team's gotten better over the course of the season, and now you have a chance to go on the road and beat LSU and set up that huge showdown against Alabama in a few weeks. So I could totally see him playing that disrespect card.
So the other West showdown, Stephen, Mississippi State at Alabama. Had Mississippi State won, this would obviously be a much bigger showdown last weekend. But of course, Alabama coming off a loss as well. So yeah, it would be kind of shocking, to be honest with you, if Alabama folded, because we've literally never seen that in the Nick Saban era. But if Mississippi State plays up to their standard, which they obviously didn't do last week, do you think they could make this a competitive ball game? And do you think, what will you be watching head into this matchup?
Man, I think it's going to be a very miserable week in Tuscaloosa. I don't think I'd want to be around Nick Saban too much based upon what happened last Saturday. I also think when you look at the series trend between these two teams, I mean, Alabama's won by a combined 81 points in the last two games. Alabama has totally owned Mike Leach since he came to Mississippi State. Will Rogers also hasn't thrown a touchdown against Alabama. So everything on paper says to me that Alabama is very angry. They should be very motivated. There should be the backs against the wall, knowing that they can't lose again or they're out of the playoff mix. Really hard for me to see Mississippi State being able to win this game on Saturday, even if they play up to their potential, because it just seems like Alabama's got a really good handle on Mike Leach's offense, and I think we'll see a very motivated Crimson Tide as well.
All right, how about this one, Stephen? A&M at South Carolina, both coming off a bye. South Carolina got some momentum. A&M, you could argue, did as well, going toe-to-toe with Alabama in Tuscaloosa. What's your read on this game?
Yeah, I think the question for me is, and what I'm watching is, last time we saw these two teams, they got good wins. South Carolina won at Kentucky, or sorry, A&M had a good showing against Alabama. South Carolina had the win against Kentucky. And I'm curious to see if they can pick up off of that, and can they continue to build that momentum. For South Carolina, Want to see how the line of scrimmage holds up against A&M's defensive front. And then I think for A&M, we saw the big plays out of Evan Stewart. Haynes King fought like crazy in that game against Alabama. Can they continue to build on that? We talked about the series in this game. It has been one-sided in favor of A&M, but South Carolina is only a 4-point underdog as of early in the week at home against A&M. So I think for South Carolina, there's a chance to build some momentum over the second half, continue to get the ball to Marshawn Lloyd, take some of that pressure off Spencer Rattler. And I think if you're A&M, this is kind of that key stretch of the season. You want to see some progress on offense, and I think you'll start to see some of that young talent on defense continue to flash over the last couple games. So I really, this is, the spread says that it's less than a touchdown. This really feels like a toss-up in my mind.
Yeah, and I think we've kind of hit on this, Stephen, but if South Carolina were to win, which again is not a given or anything, but they have got a clear path to set a 7-2 start to the season, which, my goodness, I mean, those fans would be on cloud nine after a month ago wanting to fire everybody. You know what?
Yeah, and here I was just saying Marcus Satterfield might not be the guy. but no, I mean, to your point, I mean, the schedule, you get A&M in Missouri at home and then Vanderbilt in Florida on the road. I mean, if Florida, maybe you feel differently than I do. Like I don't pencil Florida in as pencil South Carolina as an automatic win for Florida based upon what we've seen this year. It feels much more toss up just watching these two teams and the inconsistency from Florida week to week. But putting aside all that, I think if you're South Carolina, just getting the upset against Kentucky and now having a chance to fight for bowl eligibility with a favorable stretch here, I mean, it's not crazy to think that if South Carolina gets to 7-2 or even 8-2, they can work their way back into the top 25 and maybe finish there by the end of the year. Certainly, Tennessee and Clemson probably going to be heavy underdogs in those two games, but there's a chance at least to get the 6-7 wins and get back to a bowl game. And really, that's kind of where I thought South Carolina was at the start of the season.
Right. It would have kind of shades of Arkansas last year, Stephen, because Arkansas, they beat A&M, LSU, Missouri, all these teams they couldn't get over. South Carolina, they already beat Kentucky. If they beat A&M, I'm not saying, I'm not sitting here saying they'll beat Clemson and Tennessee, but hell, they've been known to pull an upset or two down there in Columbia under Shane Beamer. So let me ask you, Vanderbilt, Missouri, Stephen. I mean, you gotta think this is paramount for Missouri if they want to go to a bowl game. You gotta get this one. While Vanderbilt, who knows? Maybe if Missouri, well, they've had 2 weeks to prepare, but maybe they fall apart. Maybe this is your shot to get that SEC win. So intriguing game here.
Yeah, it really is. I think, for me, from Missouri, this is the stretch that will sort of decide whether or not they can get to 6 wins. And I think your hope is the close losses earlier from before the bye week. Now with 2 weeks to prepare, Missouri can sort of turn a corner in some of those offensive things. They can sort of either fix them or mitigate it enough to where they can get the offense on track, generate some big plays. Vanderbilt, a pretty favorable opponent to do so. On the other side for Vanderbilt, I think we talked about the progress in league play. They're a 2-touchdown underdog on the road. This feels like a spot that if you're Clark Lee and Vanderbilt, maybe you don't win, but if you can just keep it closer, it would give you some good signs going into the rest of the season. So I think there's sort of a kind of an appearance thing here. Like if you're Vanderbilt, you want to play well, show some progress. And on the flip side, if you're Missouri, you want to show that, hey, the last couple of weeks were no fluke. We are a much better team as we go into November and what is a very important stretch for bowl potential.
And then final game, I mean, I don't know how much of a game it is, Stephen, but UT Martin versus Tennessee. If I'm a Vol, I'm just thanking my lucky stars. This is our opponent after that celebration on Saturday night, because if this was Kentucky, if this was, South Carolina, Missouri, hell, I'm not sitting here saying I would be picking the upset, but I would not be stunned if, focus is hard to come by this week on Rocky Top.
Oh yeah, I would say this is some very shrewd scheduling by Tennessee. It's one of those things that kind of snuck up on me because a couple of weeks ago I was looking, I was like, Tennessee, they get UT Martin at the week after they play Alabama. Very good scheduling on Tennessee's part. But yeah, I think considering all that happened on Saturday, you do not want to go on the road and play Kentucky or go play at South Carolina. This is the perfect opponent after beating Alabama. I think there's probably not much that Tennessee can take away from this game. I think really the important thing is just don't get anybody hurt. Like just get in, get out, get the victory, keep everybody healthy, and head into the key stretch of the season with Georgia coming up at full strength. So I don't anticipate a very close game, even if Tennessee's only at 70% on Saturday. They should be able to win that one.
All right, Stephen. Well, I really appreciate you stopping by once again and just sharing so much knowledge like you always do. Before you go, can you tell the audience where to find all your outstanding work?
Absolutely. So you can follow me on Twitter at Athlon Steven. You can also check out my work at athlonsports.com. You can stop by our Twitter space too on Monday mornings, 11 a.m. Eastern Time. Me and my co-host, Braden Gall, we talk through everything in college football for about an hour. So stop by, talk about the SEC. You can also check out my YouTube page at All CFB 365.
All right, I hope you guys appreciated that. Little deep dive there with Stephen, able to hit on all 14 SEC teams like we love to do, and we do when I don't forget to mention a damn game. But hey, I made sure not to do that this time around. But that is going to do it for this episode of the show. Cousin Shane will be back on the next one as we preview some of these upcoming games this weekend in the SEC. But thanks for tuning in. Appreciate each and every one of you for hanging in there with us. We'll catch you on the next one.